Slavery. Now, this is a topic that has plagued humanity for thousands of years. And it is one that I particularly talk about a lot because my first book is called Slavery Gone for Good. And the reason why it's important to look at slavery is, well, if we look at the previous topics we looked at, they deal with the idea that nature is this answer or is this authority, and that's how we respect nature, that's how we understand it. And so if we don't have our respect there and our authority is not there, we don't seek to understand it, and we're disregarding it and we're putting it in the back burner, what is the effect of that ultimately? And so let's just first break down slavery and see if there's any connections to be made here. Is slavery unnatural? Well, there's a reason perhaps why humanity has gotten rid of it and why nobody will try it today. Why people see it as immoral and therefore unnatural. Let's look at some definitions by some abolitionists who lived in the time, the 1800s. Slavery is voluntary or involuntary. Voluntary when one sells or yields his or her own person to the irresponsible will of another. Involuntary when placed under the absolute power of another without one's own consent. So that is saying that slavery can be voluntary or involuntary, right? Slavery, a lot of people think, is just ball and chain slavery, but here you hear it from an abolitionist himself from that time period where we say slavery was abolished, where he's saying it's more than just that. It is understanding that no person belongs to another, and here you have another definition that goes alongside that by Henry Clark Wright, where he says slavery is submission or subjection to control by the will of another being. Okay, so that's not saying specifically, oh, you chain this person up and you call them this and call them that and make sure they go on the plantation and they get unpaid labor, right? It's saying specifically submission or subjection to control by the will of another being. And here you have another definition. This one's from a professor. He states slavery is theft. Theft of a life, theft of work, theft of any property or produce, theft even of the children a slave might have born. Right? Because if you were born in a slave family, you would naturally be a slave. Right? You're born into that slave family, well, now you're a slave because you were born in that family. And so it sort of made life seem very natural to the slaves to be a slave, and it was natural to the slave owners to have slaves because everybody else did it, and because everybody saw it as necessary for the economy or necessary for the world, and therefore they saw it as morally justifiable, or they saw it as natural to have within society. But what is slavery? Slavery is the claim of ownership over the life or property of another. So if we were to apply truth or nature to this, do I own you? Can I claim ownership over the life or property of you? And a lot of people, if I ask this question to them, would say, no, you do not. I own that for myself, truthfully, because I earned it, I've had it, duration, labor, all the things we talked about before, what defines natural property, what defines natural rights. It's this idea that, this authority cannot be in man, but in ourselves and in nature, because we ourselves are part of nature. So we have a connectivity and a role and a time and place to understand within nature, and the fact that we are not God, we can't determine for other people what their rights are and tell them how to live their life. Well, what is slavery? It's telling people how to live their life and saying these are your rights, this is what you can or cannot do with your own nature. It's limiting their natural powers, limiting anything natural that an individual can do with their natural body. Because you're claiming ownership over that body, over that individual's own life. And life is just another word for nature, right? So they can't live their life because they're being told what to do. And so there goes the idea of Wu Wei and Zoran, the slave masters constantly imposing their conditions upon the slave, and the slave has no choice but to go with it. The only thing that they're doing is just embracing man's authority, but they're not embracing the natural, they're not embracing nature. So they may have the Wu Wei aspect of just let things go, but they're not embracing what needs to be embraced. And therefore you see conflicts occur, and you see a lot of unnatural scenarios occur. And that is what you see with slavery. And so a lot of questions would come from this. A lot of questions, when you see this and you look at these definitions, you should be asking yourself a lot of questions like, how did we get there? How come slavery has existed for thousands of years and nobody got rid of it, and some people got rid of it in the 1800s? And what if there's other forms of slavery? And how come we can't define slavery nowadays? I would hope that you're asking those questions, because to me, that is really, really important. Slavery, then, is unnatural doing, because all wrongdoings are forms of slavery. If you are saying, I can steal from you, I can do violence to you, you're claiming their property. You can do whatever you want to them. You're claiming to do something against their will, something that they don't want happening to them. So all wrongdoings, as they are all forms of theft, all forms of violence, they're also all forms of slavery. And slavery is not natural, because no one is born out of the womb with chains attached to them, right? Some people may get them on a birth certificate and say they're naturalized into some sort of system, or that they have to obey and pay some sort of tax. But does nature ask that of you? Did nature ever ask that of you? See, slavery is not a necessary evil as everybody thought it was back then, and nobody is by nature a slave. And that's why, as we talked about before with natural morality, Frederick Douglass proved the fact that he is not a slave by nature. See, he is not a slave, because truthfully he owns himself, and truthfully you own yourself, and he would do no wrong by leaving you be you and leaving himself be himself. He's embracing his state, you're embracing your state. Nobody's interfering with each other. And if we want to, talk to each other and correspond with each other, then our answers are aligned. Our time and place is met. We are aligned to each other. We are not pushing one down to get ourselves higher. We're not doing anything like that. We are basically working in harmony. We are working with the natures that be. And that is essentially what it means to free ourselves from slavery in this case, because we're recognizing that there's freedoms that nature provides for us, that slavery is a man-made imposed condition that occurred because people believed that they should. People believed that they should be enslaved, or that others should be enslaved. So it's necessary then to talk about the mind and the brain, because if there's a belief present that some people think, hey, this person should be a slave and this person shouldn't, there's a belief involved. Now you say, well, Corey, we're talking about slavery, how is this relevant to this day? Remember I asked that question before, though. Are there other forms of slavery? So let's talk about these different forms of slavery. I'm actually going to tell you that of all the forms of slavery you might be able to identify in your life based on the definitions we talked about, they can be deduced to these two forms of slavery: mental slavery and physical slavery. Okay? And I want you to ask yourself also which one you think is more dangerous. Okay? And you might say it's physical slavery, but it might actually be mental slavery. So, mental slavery is self-imposed obedience or statism to man-made authority. Quote-unquote authority, again, because man does not have an innate authority by nature. They have to make that by a belief system. They have to say, I have more rights than you, I can own this, that you can't own, I can own you, and you can't own yourself. It's an authority that is man-made, man-imposed. Okay, but physical slavery is violently imposed obedience or statism to man-made authority. So, take for example, there's this slave on this plantation, right? He thinks that he should be a slave. That is mental slavery. But what's probably keeping him in his mental slavery is also the fact that he knows if he leaves the plantation, someone's going to be there to get him, whether it's the slave patrol, or his own master, whipping him and punishing him and saying, get back on the plantation. Violence is used to keep the slave in compliance. Fear is used as a tactic to keep the person in their slavery. So, it keeps an individual in their mental slavery. The physical slavery contributes to the mental slavery. And if the slave really, just succumbs to their condition and thinks, I'm meant to be a slave and I don't want to fight this, and I have no chance of fighting this, then they succumb to their mental slavery, and that leads them to constant physical slavery, which is what they're under, right? They're under physical slavery, having to do that work. And they're under even more physical slavery when they're getting whipped if they don't do that work. But either way, they're enslaved, right? And so it's important to understand that somebody can believe that they should be a slave, and somebody could also be violently imposed into being a slave. They're both equally as bad as each other, and they both contribute to each other. But what mental slavery is self-imposed denaturing, and physical slavery is violently imposed denaturing. So, that is something we need to understand. If slavery is an unnatural condition, something that's not natural for any human being because it's also immoral, because these things relate, then mental slavery is saying, well, it's okay, this wrongdoing, this unnatural thing is okay, and therefore I can give way to denaturing, I can give way to the unnatural. And physical slavery says, well, you have to go to the unnatural, you have to be denatured, okay? And that's essentially physical slavery. It's brute force, it's overt. We'll talk about that. Mental slavery is also internal. It's the belief that physical slavery is at all in any way legitimate. Okay? So notice mental slavery gives way to physical slavery, but it believes that physical slavery is in any way at all legitimate. Now again, this belief is also considered, order following or statism. Okay? Now, physical slavery is external, okay, because somebody is forcing you with violence, saying you have to comply. You're not telling yourself you have to comply. You tell yourself after the fact, after somebody says you have to comply, right? So, physical slavery can come in the form of human government, domestic servitude, sex trafficking, forced labor, bonded labor, child labor, forced marriage, just for some examples, right? And these are some of the main examples of slavery in today's world, modern slavery. And you see human government is up there. Well, think about it. Government. What is government? It's human-made, it's man-made. It's not something that is natural, because humans are in control of it. Humans made it, right? We feel like we need it. We feel like it's natural. But is government actually on the side of physical slavery? Well, people believe in it, so there's some mental attachment to it. And what does the word statism mean? Statism, quite literally, is stateism, creating the state, which we call government. So we need to break that down more. Let's look at some of these quotes, mental slavery and physical slavery, and why these two relate. Quote, "If I could have convinced more slaves that they were slaves, I could have freed thousands more. It is demonstrated that to capture a man it is not sufficient to enslave his body, it is necessary to enlist his reason. That to free a man it is not enough to strike the shackles from his limbs. His mind must be liberated from bondage to his own ignorance." So to his own unnatural condition, he needs to be liberated from his unnatural condition into the more natural condition. He needs to seek the answer, the reason, the intent, the purpose, nature, right? Another quote, "If a slave can be convinced that he should be a slave, that his enslavement is both proper and legitimate, that he is the rightful property of his master, and he has an obligation to produce as much as possible for his master, then he does not need to be physically oppressed. In other words, enslaving the mind makes enslaving the body unnecessary." And again, this goes into the idea, again, of the principle of mentalism. The fact that all is mind and all is created in the mind. We talked about the Hermetic principle. We talked about how the mind is really important. We talked about how knowledge is really important. Well, can you really have knowledge if your mind is enslaved? If you're being mind controlled? Okay, and when I put that human government on there, we're going to look more into this because, well, people are in fear of disobeying their governments, are they not? And governments use violence as the tactic to keep people in compliance against their own will. So, can this relate at all to slavery? And, well, governments and slavery, how far do they go back in history, right? So, here's another quote, "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds." None but ourselves, right? Because again, our nature belongs with us. It relies on us. Use nature for nature. Here's another quote: "True freedom is impossible without a mind made free by discipline." That's where the temperance comes in. That's where time and place comes in. To understand where freedom belongs. And again, he says true freedom, natural freedom. Because freedom, in the true sense, means it's truthful. Freedom that belongs naturally. And it's impossible without a mind made free by discipline. Temperance is necessary for justice, essentially. Here you have another quote: "As long as the mind is enslaved, the body can never be free. Psychological freedom and a firm sense of self-esteem is the most powerful weapon against the long night of physical slavery." By Martin Luther King Jr. And some of these other quotes: Bob Marley, Larkin Rose, Mortimer Adler, Manly P. Hall, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman's a former slave and abolitionist, right? Here's another quote: "The cultures of earth teach you to accept, to yield, and to obey. The end of evil is found in refusing the slavery of the mind." Of the mind. He didn't just end the sentence at refusing the slavery. He said slavery of the mind in particular. That was by Jeremy Locke, an author. Now here is another quote: "I did not know I was a slave until I found out I couldn't do the things I wanted." So that's sort of the physical slavery, instilling in the slave this mental slavery, the fact that they should be a slave. That's by Frederick Douglass, again, former slave and abolitionist. Here you have another quote, Mahatma Gandhi: "How can one be compelled to accept slavery? I simply refuse to do the master's bidding. He may torture me, break my bones to atoms, and even kill me. He will then have my dead body, not my obedience. Ultimately, therefore, it is I who am the victor, and not he, for he has failed in getting me to do what he wanted done." See, somebody can take away your physical body, but they cannot take away your mind, your soul. That is something that you have, okay? And something nobody can take from you but you. And again, that's why mental slavery is so important. Because if you can convince yourself that you're free and that you, by nature, are free, then who's going to take that from you, right? They'd have to violently impose that upon you. And even then, do they still have you? Your mind is only your mind, right? They can try so hard to brainwash you, and there's many methods now that they're trying to control people's minds in the world. So many different people are experimenting with these things. I mean, that within itself is not a natural experiment, right? But nonetheless, when it happens, well, how strong will you be able to resist it? How much can we prevent that? Right? That depends on your mind, your will, your willpower, your strength, your courage, your tolerance, all this stuff. Here's another quote: "Just as to establish slavery it was necessary to do violence to nature, so it was necessary to alter nature to perpetuate such a right." Okay, so what he's saying here, and this is a philosopher, it's really well known, he's saying that in order to establish slavery, you have to do violence to nature, but not just violence, not just physical slavery, but you have to alter nature itself. You have to change the real works, the entire deal. You have to denature everything from the core up, all the way. Make the whole system work this way, so that way slavery is seen by everyone as legitimate. So that way everybody is just normal and thinks slavery is meant to exist, right? It's part of life. It's part of nature. It's a necessary evil. Because people don't want to confront the evil. If they recognize it's an evil, then it doesn't belong. Since when is there a necessary evil? It's nonsense. Freedom from servitude comes not from violent action, but from the refusal to serve. See? Refusal, that's in the mind. Okay, so when you free yourself from servitude, it's not necessarily from defending your rights. It's first understanding that you need to defend your rights. That's a mental process that comes first and foremost. Here's another quote: "The cause of the bad conditions and of the existing slavery lies in the violence used by governments. There is only one way to abolish governmental violence: that people should abstain from participating in violence." And that's a quote from the great Leo Tolstoy again. He's actually known as one of the greatest writers of all time. The quote we talked about before was Etienne de la Boétie, who is a French writer who has a great writing on the discourse of voluntary servitude. And here's another quote from Leo Tolstoy: "The cause of slavery is legislation. Legislation rests on organized violence." Well, what is legislation? Wait a second. Leo Tolstoy, one of the greatest writers of all time, telling us about legislation and organized violence, what is every law backed by? It's backed by violence. The slave begins by demanding justice and ends by wanting to wear a crown. I think this is a good way of putting it, you know? Anyone given the chance to have power, these are other quotes too. People talk about the nature of power and how it corrupts people. Tolkien talks about the nature of power and the ring, this greed and attachment to that ring. You can't get rid of it out of your life, out of your mind. You always want to hold on to it. And I did a whole presentation about that. But the slave begins by demanding justice, and they demand it. That's the very first problem. They demand justice, but they end with wanting to wear the crown. Because they should understand that you cannot demand for justice. You cannot beg to be free. You can't beg the master and say, could you please be nicer to me? You need to free yourself. You can try to make your conditions better, and you can, possibly. And you can go to another plantation where it is better. But are you still going to be a slave? Yes. And this idea of, well, if you still have it in you, this belief that there needs to be somebody in control of others, and there needs to be the slave-master dynamic, then you will still create that dynamic. Even if you manage to make things better, or you manage to turn things on its head, it will just come back again because everybody believes in having that slave-master dynamic. So you can say, all right, let's stop it. No more slave-master, no more slave. But if they still believe that they should have slave-masters and slaves, whether it's the slave or the slave-master, and they're still doing the means to which to acquire that, then it's just going to happen again. It's just going to happen again because people believe in it, because people think that it's legitimate and necessary to have slavery. And so it's important to note that hypocrisy that happens. And here you have another quote, little men, whether by instinct or internal prompting, will always pursue wealth and power at the expense of their better nature. Better nature. What does that mean? That the nature that they could achieve, their truer nature, may you say. Better, gooder, right? More natural nature. And so instead of becoming more natural, little men will pursue wealth and power at the expense, and therefore toward the unnatural, toward the denaturing. And this is what happens, with insecurity. You want power over others because to fill this void that you have in your life, you want to manipulate others, and it makes you feel better, a little bit more security. But you're not actually happy, and so you have to take it out on your slave. The slave master who deals with this scenario and actually becomes abusive with their slaves, because they're so used to it, and it helps them feel better. It takes out their anger. They take it out on their own slave, their own family, what have you. So again, the importance of temperance, the importance of having a strong will, not letting instincts take us over, and understanding that insecurity can lead us to wanting power and artificial things. Because we're not secure with who we are, how could we be at comfort? How could we be at peace? How could we be present and embrace the natural world? Well, we can't. If we're always insecure and feel like, we have to go everywhere and always at a rush and nothing's ever right and nature is just imperfect, so we have to perfect everything with man's creation. Something to definitely keep in mind. So let's talk about this now. With the Leo Tolstoy quote and what I talked about before, human government being backed by violence, as every government has been in history and ever will be, people try to claim and say, governments can protect the rights of people. Have they ever? Will they ever? What's required for that? And I'm sure you're going to have to input your opinion somewhere. You're going to have to input your will. And how are you going to get those things done without violence? See, government is violence. It's a monopoly on violence. A lot of people call it that. And so if we look at the act of slavery, it's momentary violence. It's any wrong action. It's the criminal. But what is the condition of slavery? Maybe many criminals. Criminals are justified. It's the continual act of slavery, where the act is happening over and over again. Nobody's fixing it, because everybody maybe either sees it as legitimate or they're letting it happen. The slaves on the plantation are letting the slave masters whip them because they have no way to retaliate, or they think because they have to be whipped, there's nothing else that could be done. And so what you have, the continual act of slavery, is any government. Okay, because it legitimizes any wrong action and it allows it to be aggregated in the whole sense. Now, you probably don't understand this if you've never looked into this perspective before. But let us first start with the first premise I made. Let's look at the criminal versus quote-unquote authority. Something is wrong here, okay? The criminal does wrong and leaves, and everyone sees it as immoral. Authority, whether it's cops, politicians, right? The politicians give the orders to the cops just follow orders, suppress their own conscience. Authority, they'll do wrong, and it continues, and everyone sees it as moral. That's the big difference, okay? Let's talk about one example that is used in governments. Okay, so let's look at the criminal first. Hey, I'm going to take some money from you. I'm going to steal it, all right? This is the criminal. Takes your money, gone, all right? Gone forever, possibly, right? They got what they wanted, right? Now, if they think that you're a vulnerable target and they've got you in a vulnerable state, they can probably take more from you. Well, let's look at what authority does. They have you in a vulnerable state because everybody else, they say, is paying their taxes, and everybody's paying their fair share, and it's for the common good and for the greater good, and therefore you need your money to go to the government. But what if you don't want your money to go toward the government? What if you don't want your money to be taken from these people you barely know, or for these agendas for other people and what they want? You know, is that fair for you, for your own property to be taken against your will? It is not fair. And so authority will do it over and over again, take your money, because everybody sees it as moral, and they change the word theft with taxation. So it turns into a whole separate thing somehow, even though it's the same exact action as theft, because you're taking someone's money that belongs with them. It's something they earn, something they work for, something they have. And they say, no, we have the authority, and if you don't pay these taxes, well, we're going to have to get this armed gang, essentially, of people who can enforce this law that we also created to carry out this issue, right? And throw you in a cage, right? So they back what they want done by violence. Anything people want done by government, they're essentially asking for their will to be done upon the rest of the population, backing it by violence. And nobody in politics is willing to say, yes, I want violence with every issue they say they want in the world. I want to provide money for this and this, and if we have this tax, we'll have this and this. Well, do you realize that's literally asking for violence? What they're literally saying is, I want violence to prevent violence. Or I want violence to make certain people better. So let's take from these people and make these people better. We're just redistributing things and making it sound well. Meanwhile, I'm getting a paycheck, this politician, stealing money from people. And people forget that part. They forget the part that politicians are actually making an income, stealing money from other people, but they're not producing anything, and half the time they're giving everybody headaches with the news and all the politics and all the debates that are going on TV and on the media. So there's a big difference here. Again, we have an unnatural problem. It's an unnatural problem because it's out of control. And it's one that a lot of people may not recognize because it's so ever present, and they feel like it is out of their control. How can I control the government and the politicians and what they're doing? You know, and we use the word they as if there's somebody else, but yet then we say we the government and we're the government. Do you ever question the contradictions that are brought upon this world? Because again, these contradictions prove that we are in contradiction to nature itself. There is one wrong, and that is slavery. We talked about how all the other wrongs are forms of slavery. Well, guess what? Slavery is the one wrong. And the reason why it is really wrong, not just the one wrong, okay, it's really wrong, is because it's the wrong that allows all the other wrongs. If you are vulnerable, if you are a slave, you can be stolen from, you can be murdered, you can be assaulted, the list goes on. All the crimes are available, and every single one of them is seen as legitimate or able to be done. The slave master can do any one of those things to their slave because it's their property. It's their property, so they can do anything they want with it. But is that so? Is that true? Is that truthful? No, it isn't. That person does not belong to you. You can't steal something that belongs to them. But people believe that they can. And so you are essentially, when you believe in government or believe in slavery, you are allowing a wrong that allows all the other wrongs. And you're allowing essentially the one wrong, which is slavery itself. Again, slavery is all the forms of wrong, and it's also the wrong that allows all the other wrongs. A violated individual is a vulnerable individual. It's an individual who cannot control themselves, and therefore, because they cannot control themselves, everything can take control of them. And this is why responsibility and learning to control yourself is important in today's world, because if you don't want to be a slave, and you want to be in control of what's happening in your world, the first thing you need to do is what? Become conscious, obtain knowledge. The slaves did not know how to read or write. So how do you think they get any knowledge? And we talked about how important knowledge is this entire presentation. Well, here it comes down to a real-world event that has happened for thousands of years unnoticed. And all it took was some people to say, wow, that's morally wrong. And now it's gone and everybody recognizes it's wrong. But that took a strong educational effort. Okay, it's not because some law or some piece of paper said it's wrong. It's because it is wrong. I can't believe that people actually think pieces of paper can change morality. No, it can't. Morality is a natural subject. Nature is nature. Pieces of paper can't change morality. It can't change nature. So what is abolitionism? It's the act of abolishing slavery. So when I referred to those people we talked about before, the quotes, a lot of them were abolitionists from the 1800s who were abolishing chattel slavery, one form of slavery. Okay, now what about other forms? So here is a diagram that proves then versus now. What slavery was being tackled then and what slavery is being tackled now. So then, the abolitionism then, the slavery then, okay, was chattel slavery. So we were abolishing chattel slavery in the 1800s, which is one form of systemic slavery. It's overt slavery. You can see somebody in chains. You can see that they're being coerced against their will. It's outright ownership of another human being. Okay? Well, what about now? Okay? What about now? We're abolishing political slavery, which is any systemic slavery. Now, we're going to talk about why that is, but let's first go over this quote. The number of slaves, instead of having been diminished by the war, has been greatly increased. For a man thus subjected to a government that he does not want is a slave. And this is a quote by Lysander Spooner, who was an influential abolitionist back in the time of the 1800s. We don't learn about him in schools. I wonder why. Look at this quote from Lysander Spooner and tell me your thoughts about modern abolitionism. The idea that slavery still exists now and that we need to do something about it. So, the pretense that the abolition of slavery was either a motive or justification for the war is a fraud of the same character with that of maintaining the national honor. Who but such usurpers, robbers, and murderers as they ever established slavery? Or what government, except one resting upon the sword, like the one we have now, was ever capable of maintaining slavery? So what he's saying there is that government is basically connected to the idea of slavery. And why did these men abolish slavery? Not from any love of liberty in general, not as an act of justice to the black man himself, but only as a war measure, and because they wanted his assistance and that of his friends in carrying on the war they had undertaken for maintaining and intensifying the political, commercial, and industrial slavery to which they have subjected the great body of the people, both white and black. And yet, these impostors now cry out they have abolished the chattel slavery of the black man, although that was not the motive of the war, as if they thought they could thereby conceal, atone for, or justify that other slavery which they were fighting to preserve. So what he's saying is that there's other forms of slavery that they were actually preserving, and that's why they partook in this war, right? Is to make themselves seem like this moral victor. Here's the government stepping in for the people, for the abolitionist, here to abolish slavery. And meanwhile, right after, you have all these documents being signed. They change the definitions of words. They have this birth certificate scam that's going on. They have taxation being introduced to the public. They have new forms of slavery being introduced. Because chattel slavery was used since the foundations of government. And we can prove it. And even if you can't prove it by the history, what about the action itself? Look at our definitions from before, right? Talking about what slavery is. And relate that to how law operates and how it's enforced. And he says, they're fighting for these other forms of slavery and to render more rigorous and inexorable than it ever was before. There was no difference of principle, but only of degree between the slavery they boast to have abolished and the slavery they were fighting to preserve. For all restraints upon men's natural liberty, not necessary for the simple maintenance of justice, are of the nature of slavery and differ from each other only in degree. So, he's saying slavery is something that is basically the restriction of freedom. And I will refer it often as the complete opposite condition of freedom. You got nature, and then you got slavery, which is this man-made imposed condition. It's all purely man-made. Man's authority versus natural authority. So, if we're going to talk about statism, statism is the belief in the state. It's the belief in government, the belief that somebody has the authority over your life and property other than you. So it's essentially the belief in slavery. In 1861, people thought it's my right to force other people to work in my fields. And now, 2012, or these years making this video, it's my right to force other people to pay for what I want. It's the same exact concept, then and now. Here's another example. The abolitionists of the past were under no obligation to explain how society would work without slavery. Well, the abolitionists of the present are under no such obligation either, both of which understand that slavery is wrong and has to end. It has to end. Evil has to end. The unnatural cannot persist. The natural must persist, right? And so, the truth must persist. The truth always shows itself by time, and this is why it was inevitable for people to recognize natural rights, for people to recognize natural law, for people to recognize their freedom, to recognize that slavery is wrong and unnatural, because the two are correlated, one and the same. So what is covert slavery versus overt slavery? Covert slavery is slavery by another name. It's overt slavery covered by deception through mental slavery, with justifications like laws, taxation, authority, and following orders. Well, I was just following orders, meanwhile carrying out the deaths of millions of people, like in the case of World War II, right? And so that's a justification. Oh, well, I was told to do it. That doesn't make it right. It's still wrong. You were the one who carried it out. That's even worse because you complied. You made it happen. Right? Someone tells you to jump off a cliff. Are you going to jump off a cliff? No, you're not. Because you're smarter. You have knowledge. You know it's going to hurt you. You know it's not something you should do. But if you turn off your brain and you're ignorant and you say, man, well, who cares? I'm going to do what I'm told. Then, hey, you're going to ignore your natural nature. You're going to ignore what's natural to you. You're going to hurt yourself and end up in a condition that is not natural for you to be in. And so, if we're talking about covert slavery, it's slavery that is hard to detect because it's wrapped in illusions, wrapped in deception. And it's through mental slavery because you believe you're meant to be a slave. You think, yeah, it's justified. And you may not even know you're a slave, right? Because you think it's just part of life. You think it's natural. So why even call it slavery? It's just life. It's just the way things are, right? And so, here's the question I have to ask you about covert slavery. If stealing 100% of the product of someone's labor is slavery, at what percentage is it not slavery? All right? And the only answer to this question is 0. That's the only time it's not slavery, because by definition, if it's any slavery at all, it's slavery. Okay, so if somebody says, oh, I want to take 20% of your income. Well, actually, no, it would be like 10% of your income. It's your income. That's it. End of story. It's theft. If you don't want that income being stolen from you, then it's yours, right? And you recognize that that's theft because it's against your will. Now, let's say you're convinced that you should. Well, should you really? You know? Do you really know where you're putting that money? Again, the importance of knowledge. Overt slavery, right? And you can enslave yourself, again, through mental slavery. It can lead to physical slavery, as Martin Luther King Jr. and many of the other quotes said. So you got to be very careful of what you consent to. right? What contracts you put yourself into. And this is another reason why knowledge is important. Again, it's like, what unnatural things do you put in your life? You don't always recognize it until you actually feel the effects or understand the truth by time. So overt slavery is slavery as is. It's blatant. It's physical slavery. Overt slavery is, having the slave master, the external owner, right? This outright, I'm your owner, I'm your master. Nowadays we might say it's a president, it's a minister, it's an official, it's a representative, it's a politician, whatever. And we have all these different terms, and we changed it over time, and it changed the public perception because people believed it. And so what you have with overt slavery is also tyrannical government, because it's overt. You can see now it's slavery. You can see that government is not so much covert, it's more overt. And so domestic servitude, sex trafficking, forced labor, bonded labor, child labor, forced marriage. Again, all forms of physical slavery, also overt slavery. And so if stealing 100% of the product of someone's labor is slavery, it is most overt. Okay, it's not covert, it's most overt, because it's 100%. Everything's being taken from you, right? So what about applying this to the sense of government? Well, covert slavery would be government seemingly less tyrannical, and overt slavery would be government seemingly more tyrannical. But there still is slavery, there still is tyranny, because you see it, and it grows if you allow any of it. So people wonder, why is the world the way it is? Why is government so tyrannical? Well, it happens as the result of people letting it happen. People unaware of it happening, or people actively saying, yeah, it should happen, through their belief, through their statism. And that statism is a mentality which can be harder to address because it's not physical. You don't see somebody in chains. And in government, you may not see people in chains. But mentally they are. If they feel like they have to pay something to someone else, they have to. They feel like it's an obligation. If they don't, they're going to be coerced. They're going to be violently coerced against their will. So because of that threat of slavery, they enslave themselves. And so what you have is a covert slavery where you don't see slavery outright like you did in the past, but it's still slavery, and people are still mentally enslaved, equally so as physically enslaved, just in different ways. And people don't realize this because they never ask themselves, what is the definition of slavery? How do people become enslaved? Government war, government jailing systems, restriction of movement, restriction of ownership of property, right? There's historical accounts, and you can look at the abolitionists back then. They were also talking about this. So let's sum up some of the things we talked about so far. Slavery, the claim of ownership over the life or property of another, right? Mental to physical, action to condition, covert to overt, statism to government, right? Because government is this condition that we get as the result of statism, our belief that it should exist. The same way physical slavery is the result condition of our mental slavery, believing that physical slavery is legitimate. And condition, right? Well, if we all commit the same actions or allow the certain actions, then it's going to contribute to a condition. And covert to overt, same deal. The covert becomes more overt the more it's allowed, and it becomes less less covert, and becomes more overt. So unnatural or wrong actions are guaranteed and repeated. That's what slavery is. It's guaranteeing unnatural or wrong actions because people have a sense of legitimacy with it. They don't just see it as wrong and say, that is wrong, it's a gang of people, they're enforcing their beliefs. They think it's actually moral, and that's what makes the biggest difference between a criminal and a government, and which is why, if you can shatter that belief system, it won't exist ever again. But that belief system has to first be shattered. And so that's what happened with chattel slavery. People realized this is wrong, right? So let's just get rid of it. Let's abolish it. Hence the word abolitionism. They didn't say, let's, do it gradually over time in different forms, blah, blah, blah. No, they said, end it now. That's it. Immoral. Gone. Goodbye. Right? Because they realize it is unnatural, it is wrong, and there should be no exceptions to that truth that they found. And so here is another truth that we have to understand. It's the fact that government is slavery. And if you don't think that, well, I want you to look at this slide and really read through it. I'm going to read it for you. I want to break this down. Government, from Latin verb govano, or gubernare, means to control, plus the Latin noun mens, or mentis, means mind. So to control the mind. Now, maybe you say, oh, that's just etymology, right? Because again, that's fine. If you don't want to like the word definitions and me breaking down words, whatever floats your boat. But that is awfully kind of strange, wouldn't you say? Let's look at more of what I have to say about this. Government is slavery because it's people imposing their will on other people. Okay, so government is made up of people, but it's made up of certain actions. That's what makes it a government, right? In slavery, it's an action. It's what makes it slavery. And again, you can't be a slave to nature because that negates the idea of slavery. Slavery is a man-made condition. If you're a slave to nature, you're not a slave. You kind of just have to live with it. It's just reality, right? So, mental slavery, which is statism, is the worst form of slavery, leading to physical slavery. Okay, so again, we talked about the action to the condition, mental to physical, right? Covert to overt. The question is, did you actually consent as well? Did you consent to the government? When you were born, you were naturalized into their government, as if it's natural to be in their government. Did you actually consent? Did you, contractually say, yeah, I'm here on this land and I'm meant to pay 30% of my income to these people which they can decide how much money they want to take from me and whatever they want to do with my money. Did you consent to any of that? Because if you did not consent, well, what about our definitions of slavery before? Subjection, control of the will of another human being. Your will, your ability to choose what you want to do with your own life and your own property, if that's being told of you what to do by other people, are you really free? The answer is you're not. And if you give way to the fact that, well, I'll let this go, I'll let this pass, what will happen if everybody just lets that go and lets it pass? Then it will just keep happening over and over again. And people will get away with more and more until people realize, oh shoot, well, we got to do something about it. And now what do we do? Because we're enslaved. That's where we are now. We're like, man, we're enslaved so much. What could we do? Well, it would have helped to prevent the problem in the first place and not become enslaved in the first place. You got here as a result of your actions. You reaped what you sowed, humanity. You got here because you enslaved yourself through this mechanism we call government. Government is known as a monopoly on violence. It cannot be limited because its violence is seen as legitimate. It's evil that everybody sees as moral or allowed because it's authority, it's cops, it's police, it's law. And therefore somehow it's an exception to morality, and legality becomes morality. The act of slavery condoned by statism leads to the condition of slavery, government, which is known as the state. Statism is the belief that there is such a thing as authority vested in certain human beings, naturally, magically giving them the right to rule over other people. This is all man-made, of course. This authority means that certain people, who we call government, have the right to rule over other people. They have this moral right to issue commands to those whom they rule, those under their jurisdiction, and that their subjects or slaves have a moral obligation to obey the arbitrary dictates or laws set by their masters. If you're going to say, this is all wrong, Corey, government is not slavery and just depends on what form, you still want your will to be done, I want to know how, without violence. If it's a voluntary system, it's not government. If it's not violence, it's not government. If it's not a man-made system and natural authority is the authority, it's not government. It's simply nature. It's simply living your life. And so when you have government and statism is the belief in the legitimacy of slavery. That's most simply put. Past all these other really complex definitions and understanding what it is, at the end of the day, it's believing that slavery is legitimate. And the past abolitionists actually warned us about it. My next slide will show you all the abolitionists who actually knew about this very fact of the matter. And never anywhere in the history of the world has government only protected the rights of individuals. It has always done the opposite. You cannot create rights that don't exist in nature. And again, they make justifications and they have their jurisdiction. What does these words mean? Right? jurisdictare, right? To say what the law is, to tell people this is what nature is, this is what reality is, and we get to create it for all of you. Regardless if you want it or not, this is what it is, and so you have to follow our orders, right? Justification, just facere, to create a right. Not that it's actually right, but to create it, man-made. Not that it's actually right or moral within nature because of natural morality. No, it's unnatural, it's subjective, whatever we decide it is. It doesn't matter what is truthful. Oh, you own yourself, you can only breathe for you. Too bad. Well, I'm going to claim I can breathe for you. Too bad. I'm going to claim to own what you own. It's not truthful. It's not based in truth. Okay? Historically, people first became slaves as a result of government war or government jailing systems. Democide, the top cause of unnatural death, is known as death by government. And willing slaves are hurting their fellow man. That's essentially what happens, right? With World War II, all these cops carrying out the orders of their group doing their duty, being patriotic, you see all these crowds of people cheering on their leaders as if there's some sort of messiah or savior of them, as if there's some sort of God, right? This unnatural religion, which is government, because people believe in it and beg toward it and say, I want you to change my life. It is the world's greatest religion for that purpose. And the claims that are made against the abolition of slavery, against abolitionism, can actually be made against the abolition of government. Okay, so if you replace the word slavery with government and slaves with people, we're going to do that here. Here are some of the arguments that people used back then to justify slavery. They said slavery has always existed. Okay, well, government has always existed. Every society has slavery. Every society has government. Slaves are not capable of taking care of themselves. So people are not capable of taking care of themselves. Without slavery, there would be chaos. Without government, there would be chaos. Trying to get rid of slavery is foolishly utopian. Trying to get rid of government is foolishly utopian. Forget abolition. A far better plan is to keep the slaves sufficiently well-fed, clothed, housed, and occasionally entertained, and to take their minds off of their exploitation by encouraging them to focus on the better life that awaits them in the hereafter. Well, you can do the same thing with people. Keep them distracted, unaligned with their purpose, their duty, their nature, and keep them in this system that confines them and restricts their brain and prevents them from doing anything natural or essential or beneficial for humanity. Without slavery, who will pick the cotton or build the roads? Right? It's the same thing with government. So, there will always be slavery anyways. There will always be government anyways. Is this true? Is this so? That we can just put government in for slavery and it works? Well, with all these arguments, it works. Is that just a coincidence? Is that just a coincidence that it works so perfectly? And that if we look at the definitions of slavery, the subjection of, or the control of the will of another by threat of violence, that people are doing that through law, through government to this day. And that has happened for as long as slavery has existed. Indeed, because the first form of systemic slavery was actually the first form of systemic government. The only form of government, the first and oldest government, Sumeria, as we may look up and may find out to be. Sumeria was the first and oldest government and also happened to be this first systemic form of slavery. I wonder why. Maybe it's because you're creating a system, creating a class system where people believe that there's others with divine rights to rule, and people believe these people are naturally inferior and have naturally less rights, and they need to beg for permission to be free and be emancipated by their masters. They called that manumission. They called that enfranchisement. The slaves had to work in order to free themselves, but that still required then permission to be free, and that means they're not free. That means they're still a slave. So government is slavery. Let's look at some quotes. Make no mistake, you are a slave and government is your master. The brilliance of your masters, as opposed to conventional slavery, is that they allow you to believe that you earn what you work for and that you own what you buy. It keeps you complacent and agreeable. You actually believe you're free. And people go in their countries and they create these documents and they make you feel a sense of pride and patriotism. Like, I'm part of my country, I'm fighting for my country, I'm free, I'm in the land of America, for example. But that doesn't mean you're free. Doesn't mean that you're actually free. Look how the world has changed over the last 300 years. Has America always been the same state? What has this document done to prevent violence, prevent morality? See, legality is not morality. They're two separate things. Another quote, if there is a state, there must be domination of one class by another, and as a result, slavery. The state without slavery is unthinkable, and this is why we are the enemies of the state. That's a quote from Mikhail Bakunin, a philosopher from back then. And here's another quote from Strike the Root, understanding the true relationship between those inside of government and those outside of government, and that is the relationship between slave and master. If someone has the right to initiate the use of force on you, if you disobey them, you are essentially their property. If you don't believe me, go on over to Google and type in slave definition, and the first definition you will find is the following: a person who is the legal property of another and is forced to obey them. Now, doesn't that sound a whole lot like the relationship between people inside government and people outside government? If you can force people to do things against their will, then you are treating them as if they were your property. You're saying that their nature is bound to you. They naturally belong to you. That you are their natural authority. But you're not. You're a man-made person. You're a man. You're not nature. You're not God. You're claiming to be that, and therefore you're creating this authority which you pulled out of thin air. And you convince people to believe it doesn't make it true, just because you convince them to believe it is true. Government as slavery, the 19th century abolitionists knew this. Many unknown names are excluded, and late 19th century excluded. Okay, so there were a lot of abolitionists after these individuals, and there were a lot of other abolitionists who were not as influential or may have not been seen in history, but there were a lot of abolitionists. And the more I study this, the more I find even more, right? But you have Stephen Pearl Andrews, Josiah Warren, Aidan Ballou, Lysander Spooner, Henry Clark Wright, Jeremiah Hacker. These people all understood government as slavery. Ezra Haywood, Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, William Batchelder Greene, William Lloyd Garrison, and the New England Non-Resistance Society. These individuals had a great sphere of influence too, a lot of them, on abolitionism at the time, in promoting the moral cause. And there's, like I said, even other individuals that are not mentioned here, but these are individuals who have done so much work. I mean, these guys had their own newspapers, they had their own societies and meetings, or they meet up with each other and discuss a lot of this stuff, and they had great emphasis on education, not actually political action. Here I have a video which goes over how slavery still exists. It goes a bit more into the history. You can also see in the thumbnail pictures of police badges from back then versus now. The same, and the reason why is because the police was founded actually from the slave patrol in the 1800s. A lot of people don't know that the slave patrol is essentially what founded this organized police system to watch the streets and make sure the slaves do not escape, to make sure the slaves go back to their master. And so you can see the emblem is still used to this day, or actually related to the emblems they used for the slave patrol. Nothing has changed. 144 proofs government should not and does not exist is another video I did, going deep into all the different methods and strategies government uses. I'm sure there's even more. Here's another video for people who think that limited government is the only solution and thinks that that is the end all. I mean, I will say it's a process to understand this knowledge. I wouldn't expect you to get it all at once. But when you understand slavery and understand morality, you understand, right and wrong, two separate ways. There's no in between. Okay? Limited government is the belief that some limited slavery is okay. But again, if you allow any violence, then you got to be careful with that, because that's what was tried in America. Okay, what happened in America was a limited government set to limit itself with documents, and these pieces of paper did nothing. Okay, because the people became uneducated. As the founding fathers said themselves, you need education to free the species and free all of humankind. And they knew that foreign banks would come into control. They even knew, like, they had some sense of understanding that things could still go wrong, because it's the nature of government. And I think by now they would probably understand, after the abolition of slavery and now what's happening nowadays, that government itself is just a plague on humanity, and it will never work. And this is what we learn from not just thousands of years of experience, but by looking at the nature of slavery and understanding it in its totality and understanding morality and having this great wealth of knowledge, which they did not have back then. I'm not going to say they were bad. I'm not going to put them down, because a lot of them had great ideas. They were moving in the right direction. They recognized natural rights and natural freedom that led to the abolition of slavery. And then the abolitionists, that also built another bridge, but there's more to be done. And I think they recognized it at the time. They said, yeah, there's more we could have done. We could have freed the slaves. And the abolitionists said, yeah, we could have abolished government, or we could have gotten rid of the other forms of slavery. There's always those thoughts in the back of their minds, because they knew too there's more evolution to be made in humanity. It's not over. There's always more to be done. So limited government never works, and it's impossible, and it's wrong. I have a whole documentary about this. This goes into the whole idea of libertarianism, monarchism, constitutionalism. But what I was going to say before was that a lot of us go through this process, so it's okay. You're not the only one, where you go from left versus right or whatever political position to minarchist, where you believe it should be limited, to anarchist, where you actually understand that you are free and are to have no rulers, because that's what the word literally means. We'll talk about that. And here is actually the thumbnail for a video I did that talks about how slavery still exists and most people don't know. This is another video I did going over nature versus government, because that's essentially what we have. Is the natural versus the unnatural in their aggregate. Again, nature is the nature all, the natural. The natural, the greatest manifestation of the natural, and government is the greatest manifestation, actually, of the unnatural, because it's all man-made, and they create a whole new world based purely on the whims of man. And if you want to learn a lot more about abolitionism and slavery, I actually have a whole series going over each concept, defining it and breaking it down. With my friend Aaron Butler, we actually go into a deep study of it, which is also read from my first book, Slavery Gone for Good. You can find that at nita.one/series. That's called Abolitionism 101. How to just decide a name for it. But basically it is like a mini course going over these concepts more in detail. Now, what is the art of saying no? We talk about abolitionism. Well, it's just one form of saying no. There's two other types of saying no, and that is abnegation and apophasis. So, let's start on the right-hand side of this diagram, apophasis. It's affirmation through negation. And what that means is knowing no, and get to know to say no, to find yes. Okay, so you basically think of it like a multiple choice question on a test, right? And you understand that this is not the right answer, this is not the right answer, and this is not the right answer. And therefore it must be this answer, right? Because you deduced it and understood that this has to be the answer based on learning from all the other answers. Okay, so you're basically acquiring knowledge to understand what is the answer based on what isn't. Okay, that's apophasis. Okay, now you can embrace that, or you can embrace abnegation. But that embrace of apophasis sort of leads to abnegation as well. Abnegation is willful denial, so straight up just saying no. Knowing to say no. That is abnegation. See, Tolkien, who did The Lord of the Rings, and again I have my presentation about him, he says that the greatest act of change is through abnegation. And I have to agree with that, because any moment in history where we say no to something does make a pretty powerful impact, especially in the case of ending slavery, right? No, this is immoral, it must not exist. No, master, I will not comply. No, I will not put up with your demands. I'm going to defend my property against the British or whoever seeks to take away my own property from me, right? Abnegation is involved in the process of saying no. So while apophasis is understanding all the no's, abnegation says, I'm going to say no, right? And so it's interesting, because these are all different forms of arts in relation to the idea of no, of denial. And they all are pretty useful, actually, for creating the positive. Now, what is the result of, knowing no to find yes? It's not just knowing how to say no, but it's also having a known no. And that is through abolitionism. That's the riddance through negation. So not the affirmation through negation, but the riddance through negation. It's the known no for the only yes. because you're saying this does not belong, this must be abolished, and therefore this is what should be. So you're saying this is unnatural, it does not belong, the natural does belong, and therefore it must, right? It must belong. So you're essentially really deducting here through the art of no what it is humanity must do. They must deny evil, right? They must find out what is evil to do what is good, and they must keep up what is good and get rid of what's evil. And so this is a process where we go from embrace to result. Abolitionism is that result of abnegation and apophysis. Right? So again, another way of saying this, if I am to summarize these concepts, is apophysis is knowing slavery for freedom, right? Because you're saying slavery is this thing we do not want, so then we can attain freedom, which we do want. That's a mental process. And then we have abnegation, which is ending slavery, right? Because we know about slavery, so we got to act on it. So we're ending it. So then we can end all slavery, which is the condition, the resultant condition of all the actions in manifest, of knowing slavery for freedom and of ending slavery. We can then end all slavery. That's abolitionism, right? So getting to the root cause and looking at the whole. So what is the art against violence? This is another very important point, right? Because we talk about violence and how it's connected to law and how it's connected to slavery and connected to violating nature. Because again, the word violence is like violation, right? And we don't want to violate nature because that is what it means to do wrong. Well, let's start from the left-hand side this time. We have non-violence, which is the idea that you should not do harm, right? It's the peaceful cause. You don't want to do harm, you know, that's it. That's it. You know, you want to live your life and you want other people to live their life, right? But with that comes also self-defense, which the abolitionists also have to learn over time, because a lot of them were on the non-resistance side, as you'll find out. Self-defense is the idea that you should take no harm. So if somebody does do harm to you, well, you should not take that harm. You need to be aggressive. It's an aggressive response, okay? It's not an aggressive initiation, it's an aggressive response. Because you're not the one causing the violence, you're the one putting the violence to rest, saying this should not exist, you know, abolish the violence, right? And therefore, you know, you bring things back to peace, you bring things back to the way things are supposed to be, where people should not do harm, right? They should learn from that, and therefore the result condition should be non-resistance, which is to never do harm. Right? That is the goal of humanity. And what we want to do is at least to violate nature as much as possible. So if we never do harm and we never violate nature, that is non-resistance, right? That's the peaceful response. So we have a peaceful cause, which is to do no harm, and then we have a peaceful response, which is to never do harm. But that might mean, well, are you going to self-defend against yourself? You may not. You may actually choose not. So that's why your response might either be self-defense or non-resistance, because in the case of Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., right, civil disobedience and the idea that you don't have to respond with violence might be more powerful than responding with violence. Again, this is the importance of time and place, what we talked about before, a really crucial concept that a lot of people forget. And so, never do harm. But also, you probably shouldn't take harm either. Any animal in nature is going to probably defend itself if it gets attacked. And so you should too, because otherwise you can't express your natural nature. Your nature will no longer persist. So if this is the art against violence, what is the art for violence? And this is where things get pretty interesting. So instead of, you know, non-violence, self-defense, and non-resistance, we have violence, defense, and resistance itself. Well, violence says to do or justify harm. That's the cause. It's an aggressive cause. It's not a peaceful cause anymore. It's an aggressive cause. It's to justify harm, right? I can do harm. I can do this, right? I'm going to hurt this person. It's violence, right? I want to violate somebody's rights. I want to violate their nature. That is what violence is. Now, what is the response for that? But again, this is the art for violence. So that would mean these responses would have to enable or continue the first cause, okay? Violence. It would have to continue violence or allow it to manifest more. So, if we look at defense, we see quote-unquote enforcement, where people claim others harm. They say, well, I don't need to actually self-defend myself. I'll have other people do it. Now, in a private sense, that's okay. People can defend others, right? And defend others' rights. But it's a cop-out response. It leads to the lack of self-responsibility. It leads to the Hegelian dialectic. Meaning, somebody might do harm to you purposefully so they can keep their services intact so that you can still depend on them for their defense contracts, for their defense promises to you. They will purposefully do harm so you can see how important they are in your life. Problem, react, solution. That's what the government does. They'll cause problems or false flag events, as they do throughout history, to justify the need for defense. And people will see that as useful because, well, it's defending themselves. It's defending their rights and defending their assets, as people say government is so necessary to do. But that's because they want people in that belief system so they can continue their slavery, continue their existence. So defense is necessary for violence. Isn't that interesting? It's necessary for violence if that violence wants to be continued, because that enforcement is the one doing both. Think about that. What if the enforcement is actually doing both violence and defense, and therefore a lot of people can't detect it as violence? That is what we have with the police system to this day, and I would want you to reflect on what I just said, because of course this one takes a little bit more of a mind wrap to understand. But let's look at resistance, because maybe that'll help a little bit more. It's the idea that you should never allow dissent. Okay, it's an authoritative response. The fact that, hey, I'm an authority, you should not disobey me ever. Okay, so if you disobey me, I am going to use violence against you. And I'm going to also probably say that I'm defending everybody else against your, non-compliance, which is dangerous to society, because that makes you a criminal. That makes you a person who's dangerous because you're not complying like everyone else is doing. So I'm going to apply resistance. And I'm going to say that that is defense, so I can legitimize my act of violence. That is what government does, and that is an art that they utilize, an art that a lot of people do not understand, like martial arts. All this really crazy martial arts that people do. No one's going to understand what to do in a fight if somebody uses martial arts against them, and they don't know what those martial arts are, right, or how to defend from them. So knowledge is power in this sense, and knowledge is power for understanding violence itself, or knowledge itself. These crucial concepts to what we're talking about. And so if you ask yourself, well, how did we get here, right? How did the government manage to grow thousands of years in time? How did slavery continue to grow thousands of years in time? Well, let's look at how government works, using the simple example of a wheelchair. It breaks your legs, and then it sells you a wheelchair at 10 times actual cost. Then it taxes that wheelchair. Then it regulates your use of that wheelchair. Then it assures you that without government, you wouldn't be getting around so well. So notice they break your legs first, and then they say, well, we have a solution for that. So problem, react, solution. This is the Hegelian dialectic, right? And since you depend on them, you're not self-responsible. And if you give way to that lack of self-responsibility, you're not so free because you're dependent, right? You're giving way to your own slavery. And so how does someone become a slave? If we look at this in a historical sense, and this is an excerpt from my book. Mentally or physically, for servitude. That's how someone becomes a slave, right? Again, mentally, where you think you're supposed to be a slave, or physically, where you're forced to be a slave. Either they are convinced to be a slave mentally for themselves or for others, or they are violently complied into being a slave physically. People have historically become physical slaves as a result of government war or government jailing systems. Children of slaves become automatic slaves. Okay, so that is how government got here. It started with a monopoly on violence, people coming together enforcing their will against people who cannot defend themselves, people who have no choice but to subject themselves to that system, and people order following, saying, you know what, yeah, I'm going to fight for this ideology and this belief system, and I think it should be imposed upon everyone. I'm going to commit violence on the world to make sure it's done. So I want to be God, I want to be the authority, I want to denature reality. That's essentially how it begins and how it continues, both. That's why statism hits at the root to not just limiting government, but getting rid of it. Because it's either you go more toward tyranny and chaos and slavery, or more toward freedom and order and prosperity, because that's what freedom provides. If you want a lot more information about why government is slavery, I would recommend reading my book Slavery Gone for Good, nita.one/truth. Again, that's optional. Or you can look up The End of All Evil. There's a lot of people who've done readings of it. You can find it for free on different places. That's a book by Jeremy Locke. Puts it very simply. Just like mine is also in question-answer format. Really easy. Good for teachers and students alike. One that goes really deep into the belief system of statism that a lot of people also recommend, and I highly recommend, is The Most Dangerous Superstition, which you will find out by reading my book is one of the recommended resources as well. A book that I highly recommend, great, and it's going to live forever in time because it's dealing with understanding the unnatural manifestation known as government. Government is slavery because it's the epiphany of man-made authority. It is the unnatural or immoral condition. It is the manifest unnatural. That's essentially what it is. Okay? Because if we look at government and we relate this to a lot of the terms we talked about before, and a lot of the concepts we talked about before, is there natural law? Is there natural learning? How about growth, freedom, problems, effects, currency, medicine, attraction, powers, experimentation, facts, professions, religion, diet, environments, health, intelligence, change, leadership, simplicity? I mean, I told you that the powers that be will want artificial intelligence to their benefit to control the population. They don't want people healthy because they can't think for themselves. They want to control the environment so they can continue their control over the people. They can control the diet to control the health. They can create unnatural professions with all the titles and the business suits. They can create unnatural facts by keeping people focused on the mainstream media and the events and the news happening every single day. They can conduct experiments against their own population because they see them as chattel and cattle, literally, because they can do whatever they want and people will obey or follow their orders. They have unnatural powers because people are suppressing their conscience, the cops and the politicians, and saying, I have to do this, I have a duty, and I'm in this position, and this gives me more rights than other human beings. They create unnatural attractions into creating worlds and some sort of utopian ideal of, well, if we use this system, it'll work. If we use this system, it'll work. Of people imposing their will on others, right? They suppress natural medicine, and they say, well, here, use the pharmaceutical medicine, because again, it contributes to the unnatural health. They use unnatural currency and start printing paper, material, and different forms of currency that is used everywhere, and says, this is the centralized currency, and we have a monopoly on violence, and we also have control through, international banks that allows us to control people and what they do because they're limited by their resources and effects. Everything that they do is an unnatural effect. Unnatural problems, they create problems no one knows how to control, not even themselves. It grows out of control because so many people are order following and going against their own nature. And you have unnatural freedom because people believe they're free, but they're not actually free. They're not free at all. Unnatural growth. That's what happens. We de-evolve as a human species. But then we would evolve if we realize it's a plague to humanity and realize it must end. Right? So we learn from that. But that's only from using natural learning, which government definitely doesn't want, and that's why they also control our school systems and make sure that our school systems are government ran and teaching propaganda and what they want being taught to our kids for their own compliance into their own system of unnatural law, which has no regard for natural law because it has nothing to do with morality and nothing to do at all with understanding nature or nature as authority. It's all about man-made authority.